Welcome to this episode of Davenant Discussions. We are here today to talk about the Ordo Amoris once again. I'm joined with Stephen Wedgeworth. And the reason we wanted to re-talk about this topic is recently, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, Pope Francis sent a letter to the bishops of the United States to talk about the Order of Love. And it seems like it's pretty obviously in response to the Vice President's recent comments where he drew on the idea of Ordo Amoris to talk about, let's say, immigration policy and so on. It's a little bit interesting, namely because the Vice President is Roman Catholic, has been Roman Catholic for about 6 years, and now you already have the Pope seemingly publicly challenging his theological position. So, did you want to give kind of maybe further context to this letter and why you thought it was fascinating?
Well, yeah, I think that it is clearly a response to J.D. Vance because two ways we know that, in addition to just the timing, right? I mean, it's a few weeks after J.D. Vance made his statement. The topic of the letter is applying Catholic moral teaching on human dignity and the role of refugees and migrants. So, and it's to bishops. So, he's writing to bishops in the United States. So, bishops in the United States are going to be needing to give counsel to their people on refugees and migrants and how to apply Catholic doctrine to that question. And then in the midst of that conversation, he has the line about the true order of love, the true Ordo Amoris. And so why would you have to say the true Ordo, unless you're presuming that there is some false Ordo
That's
Amoris
right.
that's been brought into this conversation?
That's right. I have it highlighted on the screen. If you're on YouTube or whatever listening to this, you can see that line.
Yeah, so I think that's pretty much the tell, what it's all about. And then at the bottom, I don't know, part of me thinks this is a little bit of a trolling move. Maybe it's truly sincere, but just applying it. But invoking the Virgin of Guadalupe, well, that's a symbol deeply associated with Mexico, right? So,
Oh, yeah, I didn't think it. Yeah, you're right. Good point.
yeah, so maybe trolling's not the right word because I think he is sincere, but he's choosing a very potent symbol that is directly connected with the current crisis. And of course, the Virgin of Guadalupe has such a high position in the Catholic imagination and even emotional life. I mean, there are pictures of the Virgin of Guadalupe all over South Bend on the campus of Notre Dame University. When I get invited to Catholic families' homes here in town, there's frequently a Virgin of Guadalupe somewhere in the house. So for the Pope to summon that powerful a symbol and connect it to contemporary political issues involving Mexico and Latin America, yeah, pretty in your face kind of a move.
Yeah, and I felt like section 7 or paragraph 7 on here also seems to be very clearly rejecting Vice President Vance's comments, but worrying about personal, community, or national identity apart from these considerations easily introduces an ideological criterion that distorts social life and imposes the will of the strongest as the criterion of truth. It felt like, because those are the kinds of things that he went through when he went through this order of love, it's like family, nation, etc. So it seems that way. What's interesting to me, and you actually brought this to my attention, was that when you look at the footnotes, Pope Francis is arguing pretty clearly that what he's saying here isn't just something he made up on the spot, not some sort of knee-jerk reaction to, an American view that he doesn't like, but through his footnotes, he's trying to argue that this is actually consistent with Roman Catholic social teaching, at least since 1952. And in particular, you mentioned earlier that he's basically quoting the Fratelli Tutti document that he released in 2020 on the Universal Brotherhood of Man. And I was reading through that, and it's pretty clear already in 2020 Pope Francis was using the story of the Good Samaritan and many other things as well to say that actually when it comes to the question is who is my neighbor, it's not like the neighbor down the road or even necessarily your nation, but it's your neighbor across borders. And Some people might say, well, that's a sort of too expansive view of the interpretation of the Good Samaritan parable, I grant. But this is not new to Pope Francis, nor to
Right.
Catholic social teaching in general.
Yeah. No, it's really important for the statement Fratelli Tutti. Many Protestants probably felt no need to interact with it. Came out in 2020. We were distracted. We were
Right.
talking about COVID. If you did interact with it, it was probably only because there was that hot button issue where Pope Francis he increases the opposition to the death penalty and basically says it's absolutely impermissible now. So
Mm,
he took a step farther than even the previous popes. And of course, they had been taking steps farther than the tradition. But up until Francis, you could say, well, the death penalty is being discouraged. It's maybe not appropriate given all of the complicated features of modern society. With Fratelli Tutti, Francis says it's morally impermissible.
that's right.
Catholics can't hold to it. So that's really the only thing I saw Protestants getting any attention, putting any attention to this document was on that issue. The rest of it, I don't think we spent much time with. But
Right.
a lot of the statement is on immigration. It's about refugees. It's about the duties of nations to the global community.
Mm-hmm.
And rereading it, I was really shocked. Whoa, okay. Like the Pope has weighed in on these topics in a pretty direct fashion. And there's a whole chapter on the Good Samaritan. And he applies the Good Samaritan. I think it's paragraph 66. He connects the Good Samaritan to that Catholic doctrine of the common good and the kind of the universal shared brotherhood and common good and common use of all of our wealth and property. He's connecting all of that to the message of the Good Samaritan.
Mm.
And he's applying it not only to individuals, but what does he say? The parable summons us to rediscover our vocation as citizens of our respective nations and of the entire world, builders of a new social bond. So
Mm.
that is on his mind. He wants us to take these doctrines and apply them to our own nations, but then he wants our nations to apply the same lesson to the global community to create this universal brotherhood.
Yeah, it's interesting too. There's also another link to here. What's it called? The Declaration of the Dignitas Infinita on human dignity. I was
Yeah.
reading through that, and it's really interesting about the infinite kind of dignity and worth of people. Again, it's tied into this idea of a sort of universal brotherhood, a sort of universal love, you might say, and embrace. And it strikes me.
Yep.
I know that there's different ways to think about this, but it's almost as though he's weighing in on this discussion of particularism versus universalism when it comes to
Yes.
how you arrange yourself politically. And he is siding, I think, pretty clearly theologically on the universalism side. So much so that
Yes.
these documents that are not, like, he didn't write these documents as a blog post. You know what I mean? Like, they are a part of the teaching of the church in a significant way. They are given
Right.
through the dicastery. They are official letters to the bishops in the United
Yeah.
States.
Well,
It's
Fratelli
fascinating.
Tutti is an encyclical. So, I mean, it's not infallible because it's not, stated in the council, so to speak, with that formula, but it's, it should be treated with the same weight, really, as the catechism. This is the teaching office of the papacy, applying Catholic doctrine and moral law
Right.
in, an encyclical. So to be sent out to all of the churches.
Well, the one line that he does footnote that I wanted to kind of bring up, that 1952 citation from Pope Pius XII, who was the Pope during the Second World War and is kind of a pretty significant figure, says, and I'm bad at Latin enough that I'm getting help on translation, says the exiled family of Nazareth, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, both when emigrating to Egypt and when living there as refugees fleeing the wrath of an impious king, stands as a model, example, and protection for all immigrants, travelers, and refugees of every kind, in all times and places, who, whether driven by fear of persecution or compelled by poverty, are forced to leave their homeland, dear parents, relatives, and beloved friends, and seek refuge in foreign lands. That's roughly 75 years ago, or whatever the exact number is, a little bit more, 73, I guess. But it's 1952, and this is an interesting citation because it's showing once again that what Francis is saying in general is part of a larger Catholic social teaching. And we were joking a little bit earlier that it sounds very much like something you might see in a Gospel Coalition article, from a maybe Christianity Today article from Russell Moore, or there's another person I'm thinking of, but Jesus as a refugee, that kind of idea. Well, actually,
Right.
that seems to be for nearly a century from when all the people who are, mature believers stay in the Roman Church are, this is their social teaching. It's part of their world.
Yes.
It's not just a sort of niche evangelical concern to make up some analogy to justify the current liberal universalism, but actually something pretty significant. Significant
Absolutely.
enough that the Pope, who lived through the Second World War in the 50s, is reflecting on how important, probably due to the war in part, the refugees were and are.
Absolutely. Yeah, in that statement about the exiles, you can tell he's concerned about Catholics who are being displaced due to what's going on with World War II. And you can imagine all of the Catholics across Europe who are no longer able to live in their home countries. And so at the bottom of that encyclical, it actually has directions on how priests and bishops are to interact with these refugees, their duties and obligations towards them. One line that leaped out, again, this is Pius XII writing, he's actually citing himself, an earlier letter that he wrote in 1948. But listen to this. He says, the natural law, no less than devotion to humanity, urges that ways of migration be opened to these people. For the creator of the universe made all good things primarily for the good of all. So you have to allow these folks to migrate because of the common universal ownership of the good that God has given us.
Well, it does, right.
It's talking about the common good of all things that God gives to humanity. The creator of the universe made all good things primarily for the good of all. So the reason he even gave you land, the reason he even gave you a state or nations or any of that stuff is still for the good of all.
Yeah. Yeah, and the Christian tradition has, when you think of the common good and property rights, it's not always easily mapped onto a modern 21st century nation kind of setting. So it can be a bit tricky to move from past tradition to how we should think about that today.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a great test case, right, for the whole retrieval conversation. I mean, if you want to return to tradition, then the Pope commanding magistrates on their duties to the global community, I mean, that's pretty trad. That goes way back.
But it's even striking. I mean, I'm sure things have developed, but I do remember years ago when I taught in the Reformation that one of the key distinctions, even with the Council of Trent and so on, is that most Reformation pastors at that time said, look, we don't really have that kind of authority over a magistrate that the Pope claims that he does. It was a pretty key difference between the two.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
And, yeah. So
no, that's absolutely right. I'm being a little cheeky here because, it's J.D. Vance who's in the tight spot here. As Protestants, we don't have the same dilemma.
No.
Except, I think if we're going to appeal to things like Ordo Amoris, we're going to cite Thomas Aquinas and so forth, then we should also maybe know what they say about the common destination of goods, the general welfare of all beings, right? Do we, in fact, have a moral duty to humans in other nations?
Well, even a relationship towards money and wealth. If you're going to... Thomas Aquinas is not an easy fit for how we think about wealth today and entrepreneurship as well. So
right?
There's a question when you talk about this whole retrieval thing, which I think we all need to retrieve the past for life today. It's hugely important. But making that transfer from what is said in the past to how it applies today is much harder than many people make it sound. So, of course, you need the translation work that just gets the text out there. But you also need to translate ideas to today's setting. In there, I think it gets real tricky. So we'll see what happens. Vice President Vance, rather, is a Roman Catholic, and he does have a particular duty to his church. Whether or not that'll mean anything, I don't know. I saw, I can't remember the man's name. Is it Honan, the guy who's running ICE right now?
It's also new, right? These
I
people have
can't
only been in
remember his
office
name. I
for
think it's
a
something
couple
like
of
that.
weeks.
He actually responded to the Pope. I watched an interview where he basically told the Pope to deal with his own church stuff before he talks about politics. So maybe he's not a great Catholic. I don't know, but I thought that was
Yeah.
interesting.
And to be fair to the larger Catholic position, they don't say that you can't regulate immigration. They
No,
don't promote an entirely open borders view. That's not true. But what they say is that your immigration policies have to balance between both the considerations of the ordinary political, needs of your people and the knowledge of this common good, universal brotherhood, the call of Christ to love others. You've got to bring both of those to bear. Francis does seem to be prioritizing, one of those very heavily. But when you read all of the documents and connect it to earlier ones, they do still have, a little bit of that political calculus where you have to keep all of the different factors in check. But what he's trying to get out in front of is say you can't just appeal to the Ordo Amoris to nullify the duty to those who are in need, who might appear to be at a further distance, but you have to see you still do have a duty to those people.
and that's really important what you just said, because my entryway into the Ordo Amoris was through writing on Augustine years ago. And what I discovered then, and I didn't connect all these dots until recently, is Ordo Amoris is largely part of the Christian spiritual tradition to teach you how to love based on limited time and availability and capacity. So it's a way to say, in Augustine in particular, it's a way to say there are some things that you probably love too much that you should love less, some things you don't love enough that you should love more, and there are certain things that you should think about when it comes to family relations and all that. And it's not really a negative doctrine like how to exclude people or whatever. It's entirely positive. It's how to love according to the right proportion of the thing loved. So, applied in the kind of common sense way, I love my wife as my wife in right proportion. It would be wrong for me to love another woman like I love my wife. That would be often that leads to adultery, right? So
Mhm.
it's a very straightforward thing, and it's largely a way to think about passions of the soul and how to, if you read Augustine in his homilies in the Psalms, or well, there are homilies, but it's called something different. I can't remember offhand. It's really about how to untwist the passions and straighten them out through love, because love is what constitutes the sort of basic Christian moral order, because God is love. So that's how I've always understood ordered love, and a disordered love is another way to talk about sin. You love, let's say, football more than God, so you skip church for the Super Bowl. Is that controversial? I don't know. But, it's like that kind of thing. That would be a disordered or
Right,
perverted love,
right.
and that would be
And
sin.
and that ties into his doctrine of concupiscence. Concupiscence is any inordinate desire that pulls you away from the true duty of love.
That's exactly right. And when you read Aquinas as well, who develops this idea, he's basically doing the same thing, although Thomas is always very, how shall I put this? He's more like the engineer mind, where he goes through all the steps. In the second part of the second book, question 26, he goes through all the order of love. He calls it the order of charity, which is obviously love too, but the order of charity there. And but again, it's still more like social relations. I don't remember seeing him talk about a state and how you should exclude or not exclude immigrants. Like that doesn't really seem to be on his radar,
Yeah.
although it maybe is elsewhere.
Well, we have to remember that for many of these figures, they were not living in nation states.
No, yeah.
I just noticed John Ehret, he put out a big essay on Ad Fontes. I have not read it. I just saw it and kind of skimmed through it. But I noticed he did make that point that he's defending the post-war consensus. That's the theme of that essay. And he's saying that the nation state that we take for granted, that's new in history and would not have been around in even the time of the Reformation. I mean, your England in some of the Scandinavian countries, I mean, those are your first nation states that we think of. And even England is tricky because the monarch of England was still, in some respects, an emperor. King of England, King of Scotland, King of Ireland, sometimes King of France, still, depending on how exciting they wanted to be. King of India later on, King of Canada. Oh, yeah, what we think of as nation states, I mean, they're not really on Augustine's mind.
No. Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, think about him. He is, I mean, his name, Augustus, he's named after Caesar. He lives in Carthage, but he goes to Milan for a long time, and he's got intense relationships with Rome. People have speculated that perhaps he's a Berber, but there's nothing in his writings where he's defending, Berber identity.
Mm-mm.
I mean, there's no Berber nationalism going on in Augustine. I mean, that's just kind of
Well, and
ridiculous.
it's very interesting. Augustine's time's kind of a hinge, but at least in the Western Roman Empire, it's Roman in interesting ways too, because you often have kings that are not Roman ancestry coming in and becoming
Yeah,
Roman
for sure.
emperors. It's
Of
still
course.
Roman, but it's almost like it's a political culture rather than an ethnicity or a national border or
Yes.
whatever. The East
Yeah.
is a bit different for various reasons, but
Yeah, I think it starts off, very much blood and kinship, but as it grows, that's just not sustainable. And
No.
so eventually
although
to be
the Habsburg
Roman,
dynasty in late medieval, early modern Europe's kind of, yeah.
tries to pull it off. Yeah. So to be Roman is to have Romanitas, to be a citizen, to follow the laws, to embrace certain markers of the culture. And then Augustine is trying to balance that with being Christian. And so that's where the whole two cities, the city of God and the city of man, come up. Be a longer conversation about that. But Augustine does say in the city of God that the knowledge of the city of God and its relationship to the city of man does have to order your love. And your love for the city of man is going to be limited by the love of the city of God. And so that's a major theme through that book. Not to dissuade you from loving your city, not to discourage an appropriate civic activism,
Ordering.
but to order it for sure. And I mean, the main point of that book is the city of God is first in your love, right? That's a more central, more important city.
Such a common sense thing to say. I mean, even Jesus says, you don't love me more than father or mother or whatever. Like and it's clear to me that Jesus is meddling. If you're an old Baptist, you would put it that way. He's meddling because it's very easy to take natural kinship or natural ethnicity or whatever it is and make that a huge thing. I mean, the longest story in the book of Acts extends from the end of Acts 9 to the beginning of Acts 11. And it is Peter figuring out that God has now made the four corners of the earth, the whole globe, a people who can be made clean by the gospel. And he doesn't even fully, even after a threefold vision of a sheet coming down, he doesn't fully grasp it, because we know in Galatians for a while, he kind of pulls back again into sort of an ethnic-centered way of living and has to be essentially rebuked by the Apostle Paul. So that's a clear and present temptation even in the first century. And when I see these discussions today, I'm almost shocked at like how the common sense thing is not pointed out.
Right.
The goodness of the gospel and Jesus himself does shape deeply our view of natural relations.
Yeah. Or when Paul says, when I live among those under the law, I become as one under the law, though not being under the law, parentheses. And when I live as those not under the law, I am as one not under the law, though under the law to Christ. He's talking about accommodating himself. When he's with the Jews, he does Jewish stuff. He looks Jewish. He acts Jewish. He works with their way of being. And when he's with Gentiles, it's the other way. Now, that can challenge, I think rightly challenge, some of our modern assumptions that the one entering into a culture sort of has total right to challenge the culture. That's a kind of rebellious attitude that you'll often encounter. I don't think that Paul has that. I think he says, no, you should defer to the culture where you are. But he doesn't have any problem with someone moving between cultures. That's not disgraceful. That's not a bad thing. In fact, he has to do it because of the higher calling of the gospel. He's got to go out into Gentile lands, and he makes himself as one not under the law in order to serve the gospel.
Well, and many of the earliest, what we call missionaries, the brothers of Jesus and the apostles and others, they go pretty far and wide across cultures, boundaries, kingdoms, etc. And they are there for the sake of spreading the gospel. And as far as I can tell, they're not necessarily cultural transfer. They're not Kuyperians, but they are there doing that. So there's something important to recognize about that world. It's very different than ours, where we have the security of border. Like even Europe, medieval Europe and early modern Europe, you kind of just go wherever, like you can travel relatively easily. There are rules and stuff, but it's completely different than today, where you take a photograph of your face, maybe you do a thumbprint, maybe you have a particular visa, etc. So I think it's just important to recognize. So you can't just transfer past to now. I also, though,
Right.
I just want to emphasize the weirdness of the conversation, because the order of love is on how to positively love people in ways that are proportionate to the kind of person they are. And so if we're going to emphasize this doctrine, we need to make it what it is. It's a Christian teaching. I mean, it's rooted in the priorities of Jesus, love me more than father, mother, etc. It's rooted in that kind of teaching. It's rooted in this idea that God is our greatest good, which is biblical and theological. And so to kind of pigeonhole it into a very particular and narrow political discourse is a very strange way to do retrieval, in my opinion.
Well, it's a convenient way to kind of meet perhaps a gotcha question with a gotcha answer. In J.D. Vance's case, he's being pressured by this reporter. How can you do this? Aren't you a Christian? Aren't you supposed to love people? So there's that pressure. And so he replies with, well, actually, I know more about Christianity than you do, kind of a thing, right? Here's the Christian answer. And when you do that kind of a dialogue and a discourse, you can get people's attention. You can generate the conversation, as obviously he did. But yeah, you're probably going to make some mistakes in that. You're going to blow through certain things. The Ordo Amoris, the order of love, rather, we don't even have to use the Latin word all the time, because that makes it sound like it's more mystical or challenging than it is. I mean, the order of our loves, it's really not even in and of itself a theological construct, the idea that you start local and work your way out. That's basic. The theology is that there might be things that would challenge the normal common sense approach, right? So everybody knows you start with yourself, and then you love your family, and then you move out from there. That's obvious. But the Christian teaching is actually there are certain things that are more important than what you think. And some people might be surprised. I'm just looking here at a nice Anglican source, Lancelot Andrews. He's got a treatment of the Ten Commandments. It's called The Pattern of Catechistical Doctrine. And on the fifth commandment, that's where he gets into ordered loves. And he says the order is this. And this is not, he doesn't think this is controversial, thinks this is obvious. Everyone knows this. We love God first, then we love our soul, then we love our brother and neighbor's soul, then we love our body, and then we love our brother and neighbor's body. So he's elevated the soul of the brother and neighbor over your own body. Which is really interesting. Now, if you go back and read Aquinas, and this is where I'm glad I don't have to be totally yoked to Aquinas, Aquinas uses this very argument to say that you should love your neighbors and brothers more than your wife.
Oh, because the body, I see.
Yeah, no, he does. He says that you love them more than your wife because your wife is your body, as according to Ephesians chapter 5, and the body comes later. Yeah. Now, I got to say, I struggle with that, Thomas. I'm not sure I can retrieve that part of you, but he does say that. He also says you love your parents more than your wife, and he even gets, I forget what he says about kids. You can look it up, but he says stuff that is going to shock you about the domestic order.
Well, the good news is you can like Thomas and think that he's wrong.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people who are, just learning the order of loves and, this is great. Now I have an answer that, these people never saw it coming. Now I've got it. They should go a little slower and read some of these sources. They might be surprised. It's also commonly said that you should love the public good more than the private good. That's in a Thomas, that's in a Andrews, it's all over the place. And that's really kind of what the Pope is doing. He's saying, okay, public good comes before private good, and also, therefore, global good is going to have to take some order of priority over merely the national good. That's really the Pope's argument. And
Yeah,
that is,
it is
it's an
interesting.
extension of the tradition.
I mean, it's also, I know it's in the context of nations and the recent discussion, but like the Tory political philosophy will often talk about the goodness of the common good, the nation. But it's an interesting question. What is the goodness of the nation in the 1100s, thousands? Well, as we discussed, you don't have that, so it's actually the people's. And there is a real sense in which you could apply it in different directions. And Pope Francis isn't necessarily just making it up because of liberalism.
Right, exactly.
It's possible.
Oh, British Empire is actually a fantastic case point. So it's made up of many nations, isn't it? You've got the Englishmen, then you also have Welshmen, and you have Scots, and even certain people in Ireland. Americans struggle with this. Maybe you being a Canadian are more comfortable with it, but an Irishman doesn't think he's an Englishman. He knows he's an Irishman, but he's a member of the British Commonwealth. And at a certain point in history, it extended to India and other places like that. And so what happens when Great Britain is pulled into a European war? Can these other nations say, well, sorry, that's your business? Our duty is to our own nation. No, right? They have to suit up. You've got to get on that train. You got to pick up the cute little bear in Winnipeg, take him to England, which will become Winnie the Pooh. That's a Canadian World War I narrative. You got to go, right? You've got to join and fight for a war, which maybe you could say is not your war. Oh, that's England's war. But you have that higher duty. And so the contemporary challenge is that can you ever have a higher duty sort of beyond a particular political kind of covenant? I think that would be more specific. So, the Protestant argument is going to say, well, everything's got to run through these covenants. So eventually you're going to hit a wall and there's not any more covenants. And that's where you have kind of a plurality, each nation or king or magistrate kind of meeting perhaps in a synod or a council fashion. And then that's really unclear as who gets to be in charge of that. But there still is that question mark, right? It's not nullified just because there's an order to your love. There still is the possibility that you have to go all the way up the chain and then there'll be these hard to answer questions. And there still, at the end of the day, is a moral element there. Even if we don't know all the answers, if we're limited in our resources. The mere use of something like Ordo Amoris is not intended to push away or cancel out such a global possibility.
Yeah, and I think one of the one piece I would add at a more practical level is it's right to obey the magistrate. It's right, in our situation, no one's denying enforcing the borders. But there is something that strikes me as wrong to celebrate the suffering of others. So it can be right to enforce border policy, but I have seen a number of people kind of mocking or celebrating someone's suffering who has to be deported or whatever. And there's something like, okay, you can celebrate the good of justice. I grant, for sure. I mean, I think that's, even Thomas is pretty big on celebrating the good of justice. But I don't think that we can thereby mock or, I don't know, just look down on people who are suffering, even if they have broken good laws. There's something about that I think is obviously wrong as a
Right. Yeah. No, I think that what you and I probably experience a lot is due to the sort of the internet discourse. We're getting memes. We're
Yeah,
getting dark humor. We're getting people being meaner and nastier than they would be in
in
other
person.
settings. And they're kind of also motivated by some interesting but questionable or contentious arguments out there that, well, the liberals have misused your feelings of sympathy and
Mm,
empathy. The liberals are trying to manipulate you, and so you must resist. Well, it's true if it is such a bad fate situation, if this really is just a setup, really is to manipulate you, you need to be smart about that. You need to resist that. I agree. But if you then extend that to say anytime there's a legitimate case of human suffering and sorrow, a true dilemma where someone is in trouble, but you just need to laugh that off. You need to develop this hardness and this thick skin. That's not Christian. To adopt that mentality, that's wrong. And the Good Samaritan parable is really meant to hit you in the gut on that. I mean, the bad guy in the narrative is the one who says, "Who is my neighbor?" But who is my neighbor? I mean, he's the antagonist of that story. And Jesus says, "Well, let me tell you a story about this poor fellow that gets beat up, left for dead." And then the Good Samaritan comes and shows compassion, and even goes over the top, right? He takes him to the inn and tells the innkeeper, "Whatever this guy wants, just give it to him. I'll pay you back later." And Martin Luther, among others, has noted the parallel between the parable of the Good Samaritan and Paul's epistle to Philemon. I can't ever pronounce that right. Sorry, Philemon. I used to say Philemon, and someone told me that's absolutely wrong. Philemon. Luther says, I think he's right, that Paul is basically acting out the Good Samaritan there. He sends Onesimus back, but he says, if he owes you anything, charge it to me and treat him like you would treat me. And then there's a couple of zingers in that epistle too, where Paul says, "And by the way, you owe me."
yeah,
So,
yeah. I think it's a really important caution. Jesus did change a lot, and there's a real sense in which I think we need to kind of guard our heart, not to be too hardened towards suffering, even if someone is the cause of their own suffering. I think you can hold both of those things. That they don't have to be in tension.
that's
There's
right.
one thing I
And
wanted to say before we kind of maybe closed off for today, because there's another side which would say, well, this Ordo Amoris Christian stuff is, you know, not really doesn't really sound Christian because you're loving people like differently. I think there's one really small piece to note is in all these historical discussions, love was often tied to your ability to choose to will something. It wasn't necessarily saying, because I love my wife in a specific way, my son in a specific way, my neighbor in a specific way, that the emotion of charity or kindness or whatever is lower or greater. You know what I mean? It's more of, look, I have whatever 16 hours a day, and God has given me responsibility to my body, to my wife, to my children, to my job. Like I have to love things in the proper proportion given what I can do, and that's tied to my will and choice. It doesn't mean that, like, if I can't help somebody on a Friday night who needs to move because I have a family obligation, it doesn't mean that I have to just not love, like I don't have any feelings for them. You know what I mean? Like, so I think a lot of people maybe were confused because the word love today typically maps onto
yeah,
to an emotion rather
yeah.
than the
Um,
will.
Thomas does talk about some of this. This will get really nerdy. He says, some good Christians have argued that our love is completely the same and there's no distinctions, and the order is merely a matter of time and ability.
Mm-hmm.
But Thomas doesn't take that view. Thomas says, "Well, actually, no. I think there are particular kinds of love. You love your family with a more intensity than others."
Oh yeah, it's true. Yeah.
So there is a debate about that. But what's important is that in every expression of this, the idea is you're trying to love as much as possible. So if you have more means and more ability, then you should be acting on your love with greater generosity and greater liberality. And many of the conversations in the last 2 weeks have sort of been like, okay, I can love this person and I can't love that person. I only have 25 love points here, and then I'm
Yeah,
going to run out.
that's
And
yeah,
that's
that's
not what
exactly it.
yeah, that's not what they're talking about. They're saying, no, you're supposed to be loving like everybody. You really are. You have this duty to love everyone. You need to be loving as much as possible. And so the order is just helping you to use that love to make decisions on when and where to act upon it. And if you are of more means and wealth and capability, then you need to be loving much more in many more varieties. And that's a question that does need to be taken seriously if we're going to apply this to politics. Larger nations and polities, wealthier nations and polities, will therefore be expected to have greater bounds of charity than smaller and poorer ones. And I think a lot of Americans recoil about that. They say, well, that's DEI or something. That's not an equal meritocracy. But it has been longstanding Christian tradition that to whom much is given, much is required. That the equity of wealth is that you have more, so you can then give more. That's an important doctrine. It's pretty trad, and in fact, it's a modernist move to reject that and say no. Each person gets to have their own private goods, and they get to decide what they want to do with them. Period. The strict opposition between justice and charity that you see a lot of people arguing. Say, oh well, if you want to do that as charity, you can, but you don't have to morally. That's a new move. You won't see the older Christians arguing that way at all. They'll argue there is a certain measure of charity that's required by justice.
Well, it seems like we are now going after Dave Ramsey, so that's I didn't realize we were going in that direction, but no, I'm just teasing.
Now, I'll say this about Dave Ramsey. I was just rereading one of his books, and he actually, whether, I don't know him personally, I don't know how his system works, but he actually has a section in the Total Money Makeover where he says, once you get your wealth,
Yes,
you should give. You should give to charity. You should give it away.
He does.
Yeah.
And actually,
just to be fair, we're on the internet here.
Yeah,
so,
to be fair, you're right. Yeah, and I've listened to him enough where I go, he's more than the stereotype. In fact, he does advocate generous giving pretty frequently.
Yeah,
and there is something to.
It's a whole chapter in the book. Like he pushes that. He's not going to use Thomas Aquinas. He doesn't have medieval scholastic categories, but yeah, he's for charity.
Yeah. What always strikes me in a society where debt is everywhere, can you be generous if you have high levels of debt? And so is there an argument that you actually need to attack your debt to become generous? And debt actually prevents... Anyways, that's a whole different discussion, but I think there's actually something important there. I think the way that we talk about debt, even getting a car or something, it actually prevents you from being generous because you're choosing to... Anyway, that's a different... Sorry, I got way distracted.
Yeah. No, this is fantastic. Yeah. I mean, and it is different. Like, it should be another episode, but it does kind of sound a lot like the Pope again, because the Pope is talking about the universal destination of goods. So our view of nations and global relations is just one different category of that conversation. That God has made all these goods to be used for the good of all.
That's
so
right,
how do we do it? How do we put it to use?
I don't think you'll find a Christian living in the earlier eras who would say you should accumulate wealth in order to spend it on more pleasurable things.
No.
I don't think that... you might have the odd aristocrat, but like, basically, if God gives you wealth, it's for the purpose of generosity. And you even look at the Cappadocian fathers, they're often quite wealthy, but they almost make themselves poor in a sense by giving away a lot of their property. Now, I say poor, but you can actually look at their tax records. They own a lot of land, so they're paying tax on it, so they must have some income through that. But nonetheless, my point to say is there is an ordering of our loves. It's disordered, I think, maybe to love the new car so that you can no longer give generously because you have to pay down a debt. And it could be that you think about it, even at that level.
When our modern riches are much more privatized than earlier eras. this church that I'm currently sitting in was built by the Studebaker family, this automobile dynasty in South Bend. And they had gargantuan wealth, right? Tons and tons of money. But they built city landmarks, things that are going to be permanent. And now here they are being used and enjoyed generations later. So that's a different philosophy than a lot of people think about wealth. It still costs money, but it benefits a lot more people.
Yeah. No, I think that's maybe a different discussion. We can have our Dave Ramsey episode next time. But I do think we've kind of gone long enough. I think we've articulated enough, and I think it's just a useful exercise because everyone's talking about theology, and man, I didn't have it on my bingo card that we got to talk about ordered love and Augustine in the political discourse, but we do. So let's make good use of that opportunity. But in my view, it should be, as you noted, how to love with the most intensity or whatever that you can, rather than using that doctrine to justify closing your heart to people who are suffering or excluding others. And again, I'm not trying to contrast charity with justice. It's, as you noted, it can be an integrated whole.